"Get out of my house! A man like you will never marry my daughter." The words cut through the air like a blade, spoken by a wealthy father whose pride dripped from every syllable. Across from him stood a young black man, dressed sharp, respectful, but treated as if he were invisible. The father smirked, certain his wealth made him untouchable. But what he didn't know was that in just a few short minutes, the balance of power would shift. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been judged before they even knew your worth? Before we begin, hit subscribe. It's appreciated. It was a golden afternoon, the kind where the world seemed calm, steady, and full of promise. Marcus had just wrapped up another long day at his job, the kind of work where he always gave more than he got in return. But he didn't complain. He had grown up knowing that every step forward, no matter how small, was a victory. On this day, though, his mind wasn't on work. It was on her, Sophia. Sophia was different. She wasn't just kind. She was the kind of person who noticed the little things. How Marcus carried himself with quiet dignity, how he never let the weight of the world crush his smile. To her, he wasn't just another man. He was the man. And to Marcus, she was the light in a world that too often tried to dim his shine. But love, as beautiful as it was, didn't come without shadows. Sophia's father, Richard, was one of the most powerful men in the city, a man whose fortune could buy almost anything except humility. He believed wealth was the highest measure of worth, and anyone outside his circle was beneath him. Marcus, in his eyes, wasn't just unworthy. He was a threat to the image Richard wanted to protect. Still, Marcus believed love was worth the risk. He dressed in his best suit, his heart steady but hopeful, as he prepared to step into Richard's mansion for the first time. The house loomed like a castle, its marble floors and towering ceilings designed to intimidate. Marcus knew the man waiting for him inside wasn't going to be welcoming. What he didn't know was that this meeting wouldn't just test his love for Sophia. It would spark a chain of events that would leave Richard, the proud, untouchable father, on his knees. If you were Marcus, would you walk into that mansion knowing what waited for you on the other side? Marcus stepped into the mansion, and the air felt heavier than the polished stone beneath his shoes. The house wasn't built just to impress. It was built to remind people they didn't belong. Every corner gleamed with wealth, every painting screamed legacy. But Marcus kept his chin high. He wasn't here for money or approval. He was here because he loved Sophia. Richard sat in the grand room, glass in hand, his eyes cold and sharp. He didn't rise, didn't extend a hand. Instead, he looked Marcus over as though he were a mistake that had wandered in. Marcus had faced this look before, at job interviews, at fancy restaurants, in boardrooms where his ideas were stolen, but his presence wasn't valued. But this time, the insult cut deeper, because this was the father of the woman he loved. The words came sharp and fast, dripping with contempt. "You'll never be good enough for my daughter." No conversation. No chance, just a dismissal dressed as judgment. Sophia's face burned with shame, not at Marcus, but at her father. She wanted to speak, but Richard's voice overpowered the room. He talked about lineage, about business, about how marriage wasn't about love but power. To him, Marcus wasn't just the wrong choice. He was proof that Sophia was failing to live up to her place in the world Richard had built. Marcus could have walked away then. But he didn't. He stood firm, his silence more powerful than any retort. Because deep down, he knew something Richard didn't. Power built on arrogance always cracks, and soon those cracks began to show. Richard's empire, his shining proof of superiority, wasn't as strong as it seemed. Rumors swirled of bad deals, of companies pulling out, of investors fleeing. In the business world, respect wasn't given. It was earned. And Richard had spent too long stepping on the very people who once held him up. Weeks passed, and the house that once seemed untouchable began to feel like a cage closing in. And then came the day Richard never imagined. The deal he thought would save him collapsed. Partners walked away. Shareholders turned their backs. And the very company he worshipped as his legacy was slipping through his fingers. At the center of it all stood Marcus, not as a victim, but as the man Richard once spat on. The man who had something Richard couldn't buy: respect, resilience, and a community that believed in him. The tables were turning, faster than Richard could stop them. And soon the proud father who once sneered would face a choice he never thought possible. But when the moment came, would he swallow his pride or lose everything he had left? The day of reckoning came faster than anyone expected. Richard's company, once a towering empire, had crumbled to its knees. Stocks plummeted, partners abandoned ship, and headlines screamed the downfall of a man who had built his kingdom on arrogance. For the first time in his life, Richard wasn't the one holding the power. He was the one begging for it. And in that moment of desperation, fate brought him face to face with Marcus again. Not in the mansion this time, but in a glass-walled boardroom where the future of what little remained of Richard's empire was being decided. Marcus walked in with quiet confidence. He wasn't there as Sophia's boyfriend anymore. He was there as the man whose company, built from the ground up, had become the very lifeline Richard needed. The same man Richard once dismissed as nothing was now the only one who could save him. Richard's throat went dry as reality set in. This was the same man he had humiliated, the same man he swore would never be part of his family. Yet here he was, the one person standing between ruin and survival. The silence in the room was suffocating. Richard wanted to speak, but the weight of his own pride pressed against him like a chain. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply laid the facts on the table. The deal was possible, but the terms would be Marcus's alone. It wasn't just business anymore. It was justice, and in front of those who once praised his power, Richard did the unthinkable. He lowered himself, not just in words but in posture. A man who had looked down on Marcus was now on his knees, begging for mercy, for a chance, for survival. The room froze in disbelief. Sophia watched, her heart torn between shame and relief, as the father who once mocked love now had to humble himself before it. The question now hung in the air, heavier than gold. Would Marcus extend his hand to the man who tried to crush him? Or would he let Richard taste the full weight of his own downfall? What do you think happens next? Does Marcus forgive, or does he finally walk away? Richard's voice cracked as he pleaded, the words almost choking him. For a man who had lived his whole life towering over others, kneeling was more painful than losing money. His pride had always been his armor, but now it shattered in front of everyone who once bowed to him. Marcus stood tall, steady, his silence louder than Richard's desperation. He had dreamed of this moment before, of proving his worth, of watching arrogance crumble. But now that it was here, it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like a test of whether he would become like Richard or rise above him. Sophia's eyes searched his, filled with both fear and hope. She knew Marcus's heart was bigger than her father's empire. But she also knew he carried the scars of every insult, every dismissal, every moment of being treated as less than human. Marcus finally spoke. His voice calm, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. He made it clear forgiveness wasn't free. Respect wasn't optional. If Richard wanted a chance at rebuilding, he would have to dismantle not just his business ego, but the prejudice that had poisoned him for years. The boardroom, once buzzing with whispers, fell into a heavy silence. For the first time, Richard had to listen. Not because he wanted to, but because survival demanded it. And in that silence, something shifted. It wasn't wealth or contracts that defined the moment. It was dignity. Richard signed the papers, but this time, he didn't sign as a conqueror. He signed as a man stripped bare, forced to face the truth that money can crumble, but character endures. When it was over, Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't humiliate. He simply walked away with Sophia at his side, proving that grace is the greatest power of all. This wasn't just about one family. It was about a truth too many still deny. Racism destroys more than it protects. Pride built on prejudice is a foundation destined to fall. So, let me ask you this. How many more Richards will it take before the world finally learns that dignity can't be bought and love will always rise above hate. Show some love with a like and subscribe to stay inspired.